Everyone had been walking at a steady pace throughout the day. Ernest pulled the wagon steadily onward. The littlest goats lay slumped over the supplies asleep. The sky started to turn dim as the sun sneaked away below the horizon. Waves of dread and unease washed over everyone as it grew dark. "We can't be out in the open at night," the dwarf, Blick, shouted, clutching his hammer tightly in both hands. "We should have stayed at your house, Ernest. As much a mess as it was, it still hit us when we had to hide." He turned towards Sir Umpty, with his bushy eyebrows lowered over angry eyes. "How far away is this place anyway?" Umpty stepped up to the raging dwarf. "I thought you dwarfs were no strangers to danger." He crossed his arms and huffed. "Always charging headfirst into the fray, ready to spike something with those horned helmets of yours." "One, we don't put horns on our helmets. They're tacky, meaningless, and a pain to work with, always getting caught on stuff and breaking off when a loose stone falls on our heads," Blick explained in an impatient voice. "Two, given our situation with these ghoul things, I choose to be smart for a change." Ben stepped around the halted wagon and barged in. "Blick's right, we need a place to hide ourselves." He paused to take a breath and looked around at the darkening woods. He'd been noticing the landmarks for a while. An arrangement of stones along the road, a tree with claw marks in a certain pattern, and an overgrown path leading straight into the bushes. He knew where they were. "And I know of a place where we can hide nearby." He pointed off the side of the road, straight into the pale forest. "The woods? Lad, that ain't gonna help us much." Blick scoffed as he ran a hand through his beard. "There's an old cabin." Ben waved Ernest to follow as he led them through the trees. Ernest turned the wagon and followed Ben into the forest. The brambles and branches scraped the edges, and everyone had to walk behind it because there was no room on either side. Memories running from Ben's childhood to today rushed through his head. He stumbled a few times as he got lost in his past, trembling with every step. His fears slowly faded as he remembered that from then on, all that waited there was an empty shack. "We're here." Ben led the group out from under the tree cover, revealing the shoddy cabin that he had called home throughout his life. He didn't want to get any closer, but stepped aside so everyone could approach. "How'd you know about this place?" Avery asked him as she walked past, one of her kids asleep in her arms. Ben looked away from the cabin. "It's where I lived." A breath shuddered from his throat. "Where my father lived. I don't think he'll mind any guests now." He let out a weak chuckle. He could never imagine inviting anyone to the cabin when his father was alive, but it was their best bet for safety. Avery leaned to look at Ben's face. "Are you all right?" Ben stuttered. "I'm fine. I'm just not comfortable going in there, that's all." He turned to walk away. "I'll scout around out here. You go ahead and get some rest. We move again at dawn." As he took a step away from the cabin, he felt a sudden tug at the end of his tail. Ben looked down to see Red clutching his tail again. She pulled again, forcing him to take a step back. "Red, no," he told her. "I'm not going anywhere near that house. I have a lot of bad memories in there, and I can't." Red let go of his tail and wrapped her arms around his leg. He tried to pull his leg away from her, but she held on tightly and wouldn't let go. "Red," Ben grimaced and sighed. "Red, I can't keep you out here with me." His gaze darted from her sweet face to the horrible cabin, and his voice rose. "And I'm not going in that house." She clutched his leg tighter. "I think you should stay." Avery put a gentle hand on Ben's shoulder. "Not in the house, just nearby, where she can see you." Marge stepped closer. "You need some rest too, Ben. You'll be no good to us if you don't get sleep." Ben's brow pulled upward. He glanced at Red, who hadn't loosened her grip. He looked out into the darkening woods. His ears dropped as he sighed in defeat. "All right," he said. "I'll stay close. Now, can you let go, Red? I think my leg's falling asleep." He huffed out a dull chuckle. The night air carried a gentle chill, and the usual symphony of owls and crickets dwindled to a few soft sounds. The fact that the sounds were there at all was a good sign that no predators lurked nearby. Ben sat on a fallen tree trunk at the edge of the overgrown clearing, facing away from that foreboding cabin. One hand clutched his spear as he ran the other over his head once in a while, waiting for when his instincts would get him toying with his ear, as he usually did when there was trouble coming. He had left his ears alone all night. Good. Red stood next to the log and leaned against his side. She wouldn't even leave him to stay in the warmth of the house. Ben wrapped an arm around her shoulder and felt her shivering. As a wolf, he had little to no issue with the cold air, and he forgot that humans weren't so tolerant of cold temperatures. He set his spear aside and reached his hands under Red's shoulders. He pulled her up to sit on his lap and leaned back against a broad tree trunk. He huddled close to her to share the warmth of his fur. He wanted to tell her how lucky she was to be surrounded by people who cared. But he said nothing. Her shivering stopped, and her body went limp as she slowly fell asleep. Ben's own eyes started to feel heavy as he drifted off too. In the brief moment before the world disappeared, he could have sworn he heard a small voice. It said his name. Ben's eyes shot open to see Red standing up with her hands gripping his shoulders, shaking him awake. He nearly got blinded by the sunlight beaming through the trees, and he quickly lifted a hand to guard his face. Red got down and hugged him, burying her face in the fur on his chest. "Hey," he chuckled. "What's gotten into you?" "Ha, like a wee child with a big, lazy old hound." Blick's voice boomed from behind them. "I can tell you that from experience, lad." "Is that so?" Ben got up from the fallen log, carrying Red with him. "You grew up with a big dog?" "Yeah." Blick brushed his nose with one hand. "Huge fella, Brute was. Real old, didn't move much. Just a big, unkempt mountain of warm, pale fur. When me brothers and I were young'uns, we would always cuddle up to him. That is until we were 10, when our beards started coming in." He stroked his mound of facial hair proudly. "Sounds like you guys loved that dog," Ben commented. "Yeah, too bad he had to leave us. He'd be digging up his favourite bones in a better place now." Ben glanced around the clearing. Ernest's cart hadn't been unloaded. It still sat in the same place as the night before. Blick carried a large burlap sack toward it. "What's that you have there?" "Oh, right, I meant to ask you, but I nearly forgot." Blick presented the wrapped item to Ben. Ben immediately recognized it. The scrappy burlap bag was where his father kept a bottle of his favourite ale, which he reserved for a special occasion. Such events were rare, as the old wolf never had much to celebrate. "Would it be all right if we take this along? As a dwarf, I can hardly see something of this quality go to waste." Ben smirked. "Only if you let me take the first swig of it." He laughed. Now he had something to celebrate, and he'd do it spiting his father by taking his favourite ale. Blick joined in his laughter and carried the wrapped bottle to the cart. Everyone came out of the house to see the commotion. Avery stepped out of the cabin with her kids running out ahead of her. She balanced her youngest in one arm while holding an old flour bag in the other. It was the type his father always kept potatoes in. They'd come in handy during their trip. She stepped closer to him with the little one babbling into her shoulder. "Ben, we found some things that would be useful on the road ahead. Is it all right if we take whatever you want?" Ben called out, making sure everyone heard him before turning his attention back to Avery and lowering his voice. "I couldn't care less what you bring out of that house. No one's going to protest, so grab whatever you can." He smiled as he met her eyes before she turned toward the wagon. The kids all ran around in the grass, playing their own games. The older boy and his sister had even started a sword fight with old sticks. Ben wished he had such play fights with other children when he was younger, but his father aggressively forbade any attempts to find friends in town. He shook his head to clear his mind. That monster of a wolf was gone. Ernest stepped out of the cabin, his head lowered so he wouldn't hit it against the doorframe. Ben had been with him so long in his own house that he'd forgotten how tall the crooked-bodied man really was. Ernest clutched a large timber axe in one hand. The old blade hung low, its edge chipped and dulled from years of use and poor maintenance. It could still prove useful as both a tool and a weapon. A thick roll of blankets tucked under his other arm. Ben remembered the woodcutter's axe back at Red's grandmother's house. In hindsight, he probably should have held on to it. Marge came out after him, effortlessly heaving a wooden box under her arm. Such feats of strength weren't unexpected from a bear, but Ben still stood impressed. She brought it over to the wagon and shoved it in among the other supplies. As Ben watched Umpty step out of the building, he subconsciously toyed with his ear.